Micro Unit 4. I think this is my favorite unit in all of AP Econ. Imperfect competition. So we got three major ones: monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition. They have some things in common, one of them being that marginal revenue is not equal to demand, so they have some price setting ability. They tend to be less efficient than perfect competition. There's barriers to entry in most of these, although it's pretty low in monopolistic competition. This is a limitation for access into the industry for new market participants. It's hard to join these industries. That could be due to things like geography or patents, regulatory capture, network effects, or economies of scale. It just depends on the industry. There's a lot of debate about this topic. A monopoly. There's one firm. It is the whole market, and they serve a unique product. Really high barriers to entry, whatever those barriers to entry might be. They're a price maker, and they can earn long-run profits. They overcharge and they underproduce. They're pretty inefficient as well, allocatively and productively. They usually require some regulation or maybe trust busting like Teddy Roosevelt. Some historical examples would be Standard Oil or AT&T. They were a phone company that controlled the entire US market. They still exist today, but they've changed a lot. Some modern examples would be like Luxottica. You might have never heard of this company, but if you own a pair of sunglasses, I bet they were made by this Italian company. Google is an interesting example of a monopoly. Undoubtedly, they have a monopoly on internet search. But the thing is, this is a monopoly that maybe doesn't cause that much consumer harm in the way that they overcharge and underproduce. I mean, if you consider internet search to be Google's product, they don't even charge for it. Now, things get a little bit trickier when you talk about the price of online advertising. That's another topic. Oligopoly. This is few firms serving differentiated or similar products. It just depends on the industry. They're definitely price makers. And here we get to do something really cool. We look at strategy and we apply game theory. These are weird looking Punnett squares. I'll show you in a moment. Examples of this industry would be like the auto manufacturer industry, where you don't have that many because it's really hard to start a car company. Just ask Tesla, although they're doing better. Ford, GM, Toyota, Volkswagen, and now Tesla, like I said. Duopoly. It's just a two-firm oligopoly. Airbus and Boeing, they make airplanes. There's only two that make commercial airplanes. Monopolistic competition. This is probably the most common business type you will see in and around the world. They're differentiated products, often through advertising, some differences in quality maybe. There's many firms, not quite as many as perfect competition though. Pretty low barriers to entry, although not none. They have some price control, a lot of advertising, demand is bigger than marginal revenue, and they can't earn profit in the long run because of those slightly lower barriers to entry. Examples here, maybe restaurants or hair salons, cafes, things like that. Maybe clothing stores as well. A natural monopoly. Interesting concept. This is kind of the idea that a monopoly might be good because they can produce at the lowest cost. ATC is decreasing at the allocatively efficient quantity, or where supply would normally meet demand. At that quantity, average total cost is decreasing. That means we actually don't want competition in this industry. Good example here would be the electric company. A monopsony. Okay, this isn't in this unit, and that's not a typo. It'll come up later in Unit 5, but it's a monopoly of the labor market. I thought I'd mention it now because it's really interesting. Think about like a coal mining town in historical America where there's really only one place to work. Inefficiencies in imperfect competition. So they overcharge, they underproduce, and then they produce at a quantity that actually incurs higher costs than we would normally expect, and cost is above the minimum point of ATC. That means they're not productively efficient. Deadweight loss. Lots of deadweight loss in imperfect competition. Again, deadweight loss is the total surplus that we've given up because of sort of market failures or lack of competition. Again, this is imperfect competition. They're not producing socially optimal quantities. And when that doesn't happen, we have deadweight loss. That's the enemy of economists. Price discrimination. This is an interesting concept that monopolies can do. They can sell goods and services at different prices to different buyers. That means one person would pay a different price than another person, depending on different factors on that consumer. When this occurs, we have zero consumer surplus. It's transformed totally into producer surplus. But interestingly, it does actually produce allocative efficiency, so society gets the quantity at once. It's just that nobody feels like they got a very good deal. Graph of a monopoly. They look like this, and it's way different from perfect competition. There's no market because this is the market and the firm. Now, demand is separate from marginal revenue, and MR equals MC still shows us the quantity, but it no longer shows us where that price might be because price is not equal to marginal revenue. We have to go up until we hit the demand curve to figure out price. Notice that price is above marginal revenue. An important thing related to inefficiencies here. Society wants where MB to consumers meets MC to producers, and demand is equal to marginal benefit for the consumers. So where does MB equal MC? Well, that would be right here, and that would be this quantity down here, Q sub SO. That's not where this monopoly is producing. It's only producing at Q1. So the area of deadweight loss, remember it's usually a triangle, and in this case it is. It's a triangle pointing at the socially optimal or allocatively efficient point. That would be your deadweight loss for a monopoly. The natural monopoly graph. Again, this is like the electric company. Quick thing to point out here is that at the socially optimal quantity, notice that average total cost is actually decreasing at that quantity. That can be a good thing. We don't really want more competition in this market. You don't want a bunch of electric companies putting up power lines all throughout your cities. Okay, the toughest graph in all of micro, the non-colluding oligopoly graph. Notice there's two elasticity ranges for our demand curve. From here to here, it's elastic, and from here to here, it's inelastic. If this oligopoly, this firm here in the oligopoly, tries to increase the price above PE, it's going to lose a ton of quantity demanded and other firms are going to ignore it. But if it tries to lower the price below PE, it's not going to gain very much quantity demanded because other firms will match that price. What this means is that marginal revenue has a big vertical gap in it, and marginal cost can change. It can shift in or out or up or down, and QE doesn't change. Price is really sticky. Monopolistic competition graph. So here's a cafe, and I want to point out that it is earning a normal profit. That's because price is equal to ATC. This is the case for all monopolistically competitive firms in the long run. They could earn profits in the short run, but other cafes could open. Excess capacity. This is when quantity produced occurs at less than the output that minimizes costs. In other words, the firm could make more stuff and push down costs, but they don't want to, because firms are in business to maximize profit, not to minimize costs. Non-price competition. There's a few examples of this. The biggest one, I think the most important, is advertising. Others would be like building brand recognition and affinity, service provided by your company or store, and then of course the location. Think about where Gucci and Prada are located at in big cities. Differentiated products. This is differences in perceived or real quality differences. So like maybe Nike versus Adidas. You might think there's some real quality differences, and there might be, but a lot of it's perceived, a lot of it's brand affinity, and a lot of it's been built up through advertising. Game theory. This is the study of behavior in situations of interdependence, like in oligopolies. It's really interesting. It allows us to predict strategy and not have to graph anything. So here's a primer or a how-to on how to do game theory. So we've got Dwight and we've got Jim. They're the two players of the game, and each player has two strategies. Dwight could set high prices or he could set low prices. Jim could set high or low. The numbers in the boxes are color-coded to coordinate with each player, just to make it easier for now. Let's find out if Jim has a dominant strategy. That means he should always do the same thing no matter what Dwight does. All right, so to figure out if Jim has a dominant strategy, let's see what happens if Dwight chooses to go high. So that means Jim can either choose to set his price high or low. And because Dwight went high, that means we're comparing $9 or $4. So how much should he set his price for to gain the most profit? Well, in this case, he'd earn $9 of profit with a high price. So if Dwight goes high, that means Jim should also go high. If Dwight goes low, what should Jim do? Well, he's choosing now between 6 or 2. Well, he's going to choose 6. That's more. That means that Jim is always going to go high. That's his dominant strategy. The Nash equilibrium occurs at $6 for Jim in profit and $8 for Dwight in profit. That's because at this equilibrium, or at this payoff, neither firm has an incentive to change strategy. It's a very stable equilibrium, and they'll end up here given the information of the other firm. Interdependence. This means that one company or firm makes their decisions based on what other companies or firms do. A great example of this is the prisoner's dilemma. I'm sure your teacher or your textbook has it. Collusion. When sellers, this is usually in an oligopoly, coordinate to raise prices. Maybe they're like restricting output. It could be tacit. That means it's kind of unspoken. They might not have broken any laws. Or it could be overt, where maybe they call each other and say, hey, let's raise prices. That would be illegal in most countries. Cartels. This is a group of producers, usually in an oligopoly, that try to restrict output to raise prices and generate excess profit. Great example for you is OPEC. They control most of the world's oil supply. A dominant strategy. We went over it with Jim and Dwight. It means that a firm's best action is always the same no matter what the other firm does. A Nash equilibrium. Rest in peace, John Nash. This is a non-cooperative equilibrium. It means that each firm will choose the strategy that maximizes their payoff and consider the strategies of the other firm. It's an equilibrium, but they're not necessarily coordinated. How do you know where the elastic and inelastic portion of this demand curve lie? Well, we can use the total revenue test to figure it out. Marginal revenue is decreasing, but for most of its range, it's positive. As long as marginal revenue is positive, that means total revenue is increasing. Once marginal revenue goes negative, though, that means by making more output, total revenue starts to decrease. Hence, the local maximum of total revenue occurs at the x-intercept of the marginal revenue curve. So add a little total revenue curve to your graph, and that'll tell you where total revenue is increasing and decreasing. Therefore, any point to the left along the demand curve is elastic. Any point to the right along the demand curve is inelastic. I hope that helps. Thanks for watching.